is Barb Sackel. Today's video is made possible by quiltwoman.com. The video that follows is titled Rotary Cutting and Measuring Tips and Tricks. The first thing I'm going to discuss today is how to hold the rotary cutter. Be it any size that you have, all that I show you is the same. First of all, the most important thing that you're going to remember when you start to cut is you're going to align your shoulder with the piece of fabric that you're about to cut. So if my fabric is here, what I don't want to do is cut in front of my stomach. Think of yourself as bowling. When you bowl, your arm goes to the side. Well, you're going to cut in the same fashion. So you're going to stand to the side of yourself if you're right-handed, or if you're left-handed, you're going to be over here. Your cut should be right in front of your shoulder. So stand accordingly. Once you have your fabric in place, you're going to put your ruler in place, and your arm is going to be a fluent, smooth motion. And because it's in front of your shoulder, you will not be interrupted in your motion. Next, we're going to learn how to prep our fabric. We take our fabric out of our stash, and it looks like this. Boy, that needs a little bit of ironing before we can really do anything with it. So, how do you iron this? Most people want to take it to the ironing board and iron the whole thing, but what if you only need 2 strips? What I encourage people to do is take your fabric and start to fold it up just like it came off the bolt. This makes it manageable for you to iron. Now take this piece over to the ironing board. Okay, so now that we have our fabric folded, bring it over to the ironing board, lay it in front of you, and I just fold over that little extra edge so that it doesn't hang down over the board. Take your iron and just iron the outside 5 or 6 inches. That's all you need if you only need a couple inches of strip piecing. Once you're done, what I do is I just put it over a chair and I continue to iron all my other pieces. In this fashion, everything is done, so when I get to my cutting, I can just go straight through and cut what I need to cut. This is especially effective if you're going to classes and you're waiting for the teacher to set up. You can be prepared. Okay, now we're back to our cutting board with our piece of fabric that's freshly ironed. What you're going to do is take your fabric, the folded end, and you're going to place it right on the first line of your mat. Line it up flush with that line. Then you're going to take your ruler, and you're going to take the end of the ruler, and you're going to line the end of the ruler up with the end of the mat, just overhanging your fabric enough so that all the uneven edge is cut off. Now, once our ruler's in place, again it's aligned with the edge of the mat, the fabric is aligned with the first line of the mat. You're going to hold your ruler in place. And when you hold your ruler in place, pretend your hand is a spider. So your palm is going to be raised. It's not going to be flat, it's going to be raised. And to anchor your ruler, you're going to leave your little finger hanging off it. This will prevent the ruler from wiggling a little bit. When you're new to cutting, I suggest, in order to get used to the ruler sliding, in other words, when you make your first cut, you tend to push the ruler out of the way because you haven't achieved the balance between the hold and the push yet. Let's put our ruler back in place. So I'm going to start down here, and remember my palm is raised, and as I'm cutting, my shoulder is going to be in front of the ruler right now. As I'm cutting, my hand is going to crawl up the ruler. Now my fingers will leave the ruler as it crawls, but my thumb will never leave the ruler. This way you have pressure as you go. So my first cut, I'm going to start down here, open the ruler, start the cut before the fabric, otherwise you'll have to nip that little piece that you missed with scissors later on. You're going to start the rotary cutter down here. Now watch my hand. I'm going to cut a little, slide, cut, and slide, and away comes our first piece. You always cut away your first piece anytime you move your fabric. So if I was to pick this up and readjust it, I would still need to make a new first cut. So always keep that in mind. Always a first cut before any other cuts. Once your first cut is done, I no longer need to have that lined up with the line on the mat. Well, I can adjust my fabric anywhere I want to at this point. You don't normally adjust it, but I just want you to get the feel that you don't need the mat anymore. Now you're going to take your ruler, and I'm talking for right-handers. Left-handers, everything would be opposite, and I'll show you that in a minute. For the right-handers, you're going to take your ruler and say I wanted you to cut a 2-inch strip. Place your ruler over your fabric and line up the 2-inch line. Once you have that lined up perfectly from top to bottom, again, you're ready for your cut. And it would just go like that. Now, as you can see, I've turned my fabric around and set up the ruler on the mat and the fabric on the mat so that you can take your left-handed cut. Now that we have our fabric, let's do some practice. So again, iron your fabric, fold your fabric, meaning if you took this right out of the dryer, let's say, you want to fold your fabric in half. Note that the edges will never line up with each other. It's just the way the fabric is. Even when you're attaching fabric to do your backings, the edges will never match. So don't plan on your edges matching. Just look down here and then smooth this out, and your fabric will actually fall in place where it needs to be. So again, we're going to start by lining our fabric up to the first line on our mat. Get our ruler ready. We're going to make our first cut. You can see I did wash this fabric, and it not only is it uneven, but we have all these threads here, and that needs a first cut to clean it up. Put your fabric on your mat, take your ruler, put it on the end of the mat, and let's get our first cut. Clean that fabric right up. Now let's do some practice cuts. You did a 2-inch. Let's do a 3-inch. Move your ruler over to 3 inches. If you're using a ruler with a wide line going down the 3-inch mark, usually those rulers will have little peek holes that you can look through to line your fabric up in the middle of that line using the peek holes. So here is our 3-inch cut, and off we go, and so on and so on. So I want you to do a couple practice cuts. Let's do a 2 3/4 inch cut. Now that you've practiced that, let's do something a little bit harder. You know, when I first was putting this class together, I had a lot of quilters said to me, I would never recommend anyone using the 1/8 increment. It's too hard. And I thought, but a lot of your cutting instructions do say 2 7/8, 3 3/8, and so on. So of course you have to learn the 1/8 inch increments. There's no better way to learn it than just count them. Don't try to memorize them, don't try to understand it. Just put your ruler down, say 2 5/8. Put your ruler down on the 2-inch mark and slide it over and count the little marks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's all you do. Don't be intimidated or frightened by this. Don't try to memorize it. Just count the marks and keep it easy on yourself. So now we're setting this up for 2 5/8. Make sure you check your ruler from bottom to top. There's my 2 5/8, and here's the cut, and it's done. So put up a little time to practice cutting, and you see that it'll get easier and easier and easier. Now what we're going to do is we're going to move on to cutting what I call chunks. So say in your pattern it says 1 4.5 inch square, 1 2.5 by 3.5 inch square, and all these odd little sizes. Well, the first thing you want to remember is never cut across the top. The top is going to call you and tell you to cut across the top, and don't be fooled into doing it. The reason you don't want to cut across the top of your fabric is you want to save your fabric later on for full strips. So when you cut out your chunks, you always want to cut down the side of your fabric. The first thing you want to know about cutting out chunks is if you have directions that say 8 2.5-inch squares. Well, instead of cutting 8 pieces, cut a strip. So let's cut a strip. We're going to cut a 2.5-inch strip. We're going to chunk out. Okay, there's our 2.5-inch strip. Okay, notice I'm using a smaller ruler for this because I want my 2.5-inch squares. Now, I'm going to place my ruler on my strip. And remember, this is opposite for left-handers, so that my fabric is underneath my ruler. Notice my 2.5-inch mark is here. My first cut, I'm going to do an overcut. In other words, I'm going to put the ruler against the edge of the strip further in than 2.5 inches. I'm going to make my first cut, and then I'm going to take this piece, turn it around, and cut my 2.5 inches from that. Notice how I've cut 2 pieces at once. Now from here I'm going to work down the strip, and I'm going to cut as many 2.5 pieces as I need off that strip. But perhaps after I get done my 8 pieces that the pattern told me to cut, maybe I need a 2.5 by 6.5. Still going to work right off that strip. I'm just going to take it into 6.5 inch now and cut my piece. So if you can cut off strips, it's a lot easier. If you can't, if you just need one piece, well, I have my straight edge. I'm going to turn it towards me. I still have this straight edge here, and now I need one piece 3.5-inch square. What I'm going to do is I'm still going to use my smaller ruler. I'm going to lay it on my fabric so that the 3.5-inch lines up, and I'm going to make a double cut up the side and over the top. Take that out now and make my final cut at 3.5-inch square. Now, this is when your fabric starts to get very jagged along the edge, because now maybe I need a 1.5-inch by 8.5 inch. Well, I know I have 2 perfect corners right there. I'm going to set my ruler up 1.5 by 8.5, and I'm going to make my 2 cuts up the side and over the top. You'll do this very often. You'll go up the side and over the top whether you're right-handed, or up the side and over the top whether you're left-handed. However, what you never, never, never want to do is go down or across your belly. So you never want to go down. On the other hand, it's just unsafe practices. Alright, so now we're starting to have all our different size cuts, and you can see how I'm actually going down the side of the fabrics, always saving the top for strips later on. Next, let's work on our big chunks. Okay, here is our final instruction on cutting, and it's for big pieces. So here I have a piece of fabric, and I need a 12.5 by 18.5 center piece, which happens to be right here. So how do you cut it out of here? And this instruction is the same for panel cutting, because panels usually you have a very big piece to cut. What I do with my fabric is I lay it on my mat, and look at my edges are pretty nasty. I have 4 edges that are nasty. I don't have the fold over that I can place neatly against a line. So I need to create my first edge, clean edge. So what I do with that is I just fold it out on my mat, and I'm going to use my mat entirely for this cutting. Use the ruler just for the straight edge to cut alongside, but measuring all comes from the mat. So I'm going to pick a line, and here I'm picking the 1-inch line, and it doesn't matter what line. And you can see I just lined my ruler up on the 1-inch line up here and the 1-inch line down here, and I'm not paying any attention at all to the fabric. Once I have my measurements in place with the top to bottom, I know that is my straight cut. I get rid of this, and now I'm going to shimmy this straight cut over to the first line. Now I can measure directly off this. Well, I need 12.5 inches across, and I'm going to take this right off the mat. So once the fabric is pressed up against that first line perfectly, I'm going to again go to the 12.5 inch mark. Now how do you do, there is no 1/2 inch mark up here, so, or if there isn't, some mats do have it, but you can use your 1/2 inch mark on your ruler. So put your 1/2 inch mark on the 12 inch mark. So either if there's a 1/2 inch mark on your mat, great. If there's not, work off your ruler. So I have this lined up now at 12.5 inches over, top and bottom, and I feel comfortable to go ahead and make my cut. Now I need 18.5 inches, and I'm going to turn this so that my first line or second line, doesn't matter which one you use, I put the fabric right against. And you notice how I overhung the fabric on the first line up here? Well, I'm going to use the very first line so that I don't have to move my fabric again. I'm going to line the ruler up top, ruler up bottom, make my first cut. And now I'm just plain going to go over 18.5 inches. I'm going to line up my 1/2 inch mark on the 18, up here and down here, and make my cut. And there I have a 12.5 by 18.5 inch piece of fabric ready to go. Thank you for joining me today. Hope you have a great day.